listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sputnik International reports expert slams Biden's hypocrisy on Gaza and Ukraine. In his recently penned op-ed for the Post, President Joe Biden claimed that he was heartbroken by civilian deaths in Gaza while arguing against a ceasefire, and claimed that the only way to help Ukraine was to continue funneling weapons there, despite the failure of Kiev's counteroffensive and Kiev's huge manpower losses. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Boards Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this piece continues. The U.S. president had leaned heavily into sententious rhetoric, referring to the U.S. as an essential nation, as he vowed in the aforementioned opinion piece that Washington's actions regarding both the Ukraine crisis and the latest violent spiral of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were driven by concern for our own national security interests and for the good of the world. He also claimed that he was heartbroken. And Dr. Horne, when you read this piece by, well, that is attributed to, we'll say ghostwritten for President Biden, it is ahistoric, it is propaganda, and it is just flat out wrong. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, I understand your point of view, and it would be simple and easy to ascribe the defects of that article to 81-year-old Joseph R. Biden, who, by the way, celebrated his birthday yesterday. And many people are ascribing the delusional nature of that article to his age. But I think that that's ageist. Recall that W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder in the NAACP, who eventually joined the U.S. Communist Party, he died in 1963 at the age of 95. And so when he was 81, he was on the cusp of some of his most significant triumphs, including running for the United States Senate in 1950, including repatriating to Ghana, starting the Encyclopedia Africana, starting novels, and all the rest. So it's simple-minded and simplistic to say that it's just because of Biden's age that he sounds out of touch and delusional. I think the problem is that the class that he represents is out of touch and delusional and is fractured by tensions and contradictions. What I mean is that it's apparent that this Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza is discrediting U.S. imperialism, the major funder and supplier of arms to Israel. Already, you see that there has been an eruption of consumer boycotts of U.S. items like Coca-Cola, for example. That inevitably will spread as long as this bombing campaign continues. An increasingly influential wing of the U.S. ruling class recognizes that Zionism is a liability and is becoming even more of a liability with every passing day, particularly given the challenge presented by China, which, by the way, has been entertaining a delegation, high level, from the Arab League in Beijing, seeking a way out of this crisis. The problem for the U.S. ruling class is that there is an influential and powerful lobby, Zionist lobby, that's embedded in the U.S. ruling class. They refuse to yield. They're becoming as dogmatic as Mr. Netanyahu himself, who they tend to support all the way down the line. And that puts the U.S. ruling class in a bind, because if they seemingly seek to move away from Israel and, for example, come out for a ceasefire, the Zionist lobby will turn on them with a vengeance, just like, for example, the Zionist lobby is turning on leading members of the Congressional Black Caucus because of their coming out for a ceasefire. I'm speaking of Congressman Jamal Bowman of Bronx, Westchester. I'm speaking of Congresswoman Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Cori Bush of St. Louis, Congressman Andre Carson of Indiana. The list is growing with every passing day. And so because of that contradiction, the overall interests of U.S. imperialism pitted against the narrow interests of the Zionist lobby, it puts Biden and the class that he represents in a real bind. And it's also discrediting U.S. imperialism in the eyes of what's called the global South, that is to say, the global majority, because how can anyone with an iota or scintilla of good sense accept this propaganda about a so-called rules-based international order operating like some brooding omniscience in the sky, as was once said by a U.S. Supreme Court justice, when it's clear that there's a double standard? And what the impact of that is that it's making the global majority listen more keenly to China, listen more keenly to Russia. You saw that, for example, with the recent trip of Chancellor Scholz of Berlin to Nigeria. He was peppered with questions about the bombing campaign that he and his class are supporting with regard to Gaza. He was also asked about the contradiction of Germany supplying reparations to Israel, even though it doesn't come into existence in 1947-48, and the depredations against the Jewish people ended with the end of World War II in 1945. And at the same time, Germany refuses to listen to the cries, the anguish cries coming from the former German Southwest Africa, speaking of Namibia, where the first genocide of the 20th century was perpetrated against the Nama and Herero people in the first few years of 1900s. A similar genocide in former German East Africa, today's Tanzania, with regard to the so-called Maji Maji revolt, where tens of thousands of Africans were slaughtered, some driven to die from lack of water, believe it or not. And yet, Berlin has turned a deaf ear to their cries for reparations. And so I think that the problem that Mr. Biden exemplified in that op-ed, it would be simple if we could just ascribe it to his own obvious debilities. But it's much wider than that. It's much deeper than that. And that'll make it much more difficult to resolve. And speaking of more difficult to resolve, keep in mind as well that just recently, I'm sure you apprised your audience of this, you had the spectacle of the Iranian allies, speaking of the Houthis in Yemen, who have seized a ship going into the Red Sea that has Israeli ownership. You can expect more of that kind of thing going forward, putting enormous pressure on Israel. And in the last 24 to 48 hours, you've seen Hezbollah virtually destroy an Israeli base in northern Israel. At the same time, with regard to Mr. Biden, we're still waiting for the U.S. Senate to be more outspoken in calling for a ceasefire. In my last reading, the only senators who call for a ceasefire include Dick Durbin of Illinois, Jeff Merkley of Oregon. I would hope and imagine that Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Bernie Sanders of Vermont would be signing on sooner rather than later. But at the same time, it's not only that this crisis is having repercussions that's affecting the interests of the global majority, then ricocheting into Russia and China, you see it manifesting in London. Recall that just a few days ago, Suella Braverman, formerly known as Cruella Braverman, the Home Minister, was sacked because she wanted to stop these hundreds of thousands of pro-Palestinian marchers from striding down the streets of London. She was sacked as a result, and that's led to a situation where she'll probably be challenging Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, from the right. In Paris, you also see that Mélenchon, who ran a credible race from the left against President Macron in the last presidential race, he has been forthright in his critique of the Israeli bombing campaign, which probably has affected and influenced President Macron, who of late has spoken against the killing of women and children by Israeli authorities. And so you see as well that the crisis that Mr. Biden did not address in his op-ed includes the crisis of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not only manifested in what I just described with regard to Berlin, London, Paris, but also Ankara. That is to say that Turkey, has the second largest, most powerful military in NATO. Obviously, it's not on board with regard to this bombing campaign. That will lead to a further fracture within NATO. And then, once again, back to the global majority, pay attention to the fact that South Africa has made a referral to the International Criminal Court with regard to bringing charges against these war criminals in Israel. This was not an easy thing to do. South Africa has one of the most influential Jewish communities in Africa, if not in the world. It includes the former Israeli foreign minister, Abba Eban, who had deep South African roots. The current leading international jurist, Richard Goldstone, has deep South African roots. And that is a straw in the wind, not only signifying a crisis for Israel, it's a crisis for U.S. imperialism, it's a crisis for world imperialism, it's a crisis for NATO, and therefore it's little wonder why this ghost-written article for Mr. Biden came up so short.
Dr. Horne, if you could speak to the internal issues going on in the Democratic Party. You know, what is it? AIPAC just said they're going to spend $100 million to go after the squad. They're literally going after the younger members. I may have my issues with them, but they're young. They're mostly people of color. And that's where the Joe Biden's really having his problems now. And AIPAC says they're going to take a baseball bat to that group. I don't imagine that's going to, bode well for the Democrats coming up in 2024. Dr. Horne.
Well, that speaks to the tensions within the U.S. ruling elite that I've just made reference to. That is to say, the contradictions between the narrow interests of the Zionist lobby and the overall interests of the U.S. ruling class. The Zionist lobby should tread carefully because I think that they're getting ahead of themselves. They may be overstating their influence. They may have been unduly influenced by that demonstration they had in Washington, D.C. Just a few days ago, where the press reports that there were hundreds of thousands. My sources tell me it was not that large. But in any case, the speakers from the platform not only included Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, but Mega MAGA Speaker Mr. Michael Johnson of Louisiana. However, going after the squad is going to be more than a notion. I dare say that what that may do, for example, in the state of Michigan, an important swing state, is drive Arab American voters more so to the polls, not only to cast a ballot in terms of the only woman and the only person of Palestinian ancestry in the U.S. Congress, speaking of Congresswoman Tlaib, but also there is a lot of consternation and dissatisfaction with Mr. Biden. So he may want to talk to these folks in the Zionist lobby, because obviously they've done a number on Congresswoman Tlaib in particular, censoring her for her statement with regard to from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now we know that on the one hand, that can be interpreted as speaking for a binational state, a one-state solution where everyone gets equal and full rights, a Jewish, Christian, Arab, Muslim alike. On the other hand, it could be seen as a simple statement saying that the West Bank on the Jordan River will be free along with Gaza on the Mediterranean Sea. But that has been interpreted in a very demagogic manner by the members of Congress who censored her in a way that it was meant to suggest that she wanted the liquidation not only of Israel, but of the Jewish people. Now, how they got to that is beyond me, but it's part of the demagogy, part of the hypocrisy, part of the double standards that you oftentimes see in an empire when it's on its last legs.
And as we get out, this will be very, very telling in terms of where AIPAC's power is, and does it still hold sway the way that it has over the past? Because we know what AIPAC did to Cynthia McKinney, the former congresswoman from Georgia, in response to her discussions about Palestine and some other issues. And so they were successful in having her removed a number of years ago, and now they're stepping up their game again, and it'll be very interesting to see if they're able to achieve the same results in this effort that they did with Cynthia McKinney. Dr. Horne.
Well, somehow I doubt it. And I think also what we're witnessing as well is a passing of the torch of political and ideological leadership away from where it was thought to rest, particularly on the East Coast, particularly in New York City. But you see that many of our East Coast politicians, and I'm looking at you, Speaker in waiting Hakeem Jeffries, leading member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, Reverend Al Sharpton of Manhattan, Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, they've all tanked. They're all in the tank for the Zionist lobby. But recall what I just mentioned with regard to others, Jamal Bowman in New York City, but of course with a foothold outside of Manhattan in Bronx and Westchester, Cori Bush out of St. Louis, Summer Lee out of Pennsylvania, Andre Carson out of Indiana. Congresswoman Barbara Lee came out for a ceasefire, although I don't think that will help to save her flagging campaign to replace Dianne Feinstein in the U.S. Senate. So this crisis in historic Palestine is having manifold consequences around the planet, and we should realize that it's not just the problem of the delusional 46 U.S. president. It's a problem of an imperialist system. It's a problem of a problematic U.S. ruling class.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.